And welcome to this year's Hillard Gold Lecture. I'm Jim Lalutis, a member of the History faculty and Dean for Honors Carolina, and I'm delighted that you've joined us. First, let me say a few words about the annual Hillard Gold Lecture, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Carolina alumni James and Jonathan Gold established this lecture series to honor the memory of their father, Hillard, a member of the UNC class of 1939. Hillard Gold spent his career practicing medicine and was a believer in the power of education to solve the greatest challenges facing our nation and the world. This evening's lecture by Kevin Kruse is offered in that spirit. Now, the first thing to know about Professor Kruse is that he's a Tar Heel. He graduated from Carolina in 1994 with a BA in history, and from there went on to Cornell, where he received his MA and PhD. Today, Professor Kruse is a member of the history faculty at Princeton. He specializes in the political, social, and urban history of 20th century America with a particular interest in conflict over race, rights, and religion in the making of modern conservatism. He is the author of a number of books: White Flight, Atlanta, and the Making of Modern Conservatism, published in 2005. One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, published in 2015. And most recently with Julian Zelizer, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974, published just last year. Professor Kruse's talk this evening is drawn from that most recent work. And as you heard earlier, we'll have some time after the lecture for questions and answers. So please, as you're listening to the lecture, feel free to post any questions you have, thoughts you want to share in the Q&A chat box at the bottom. And we will have plenty of time to address your questions at the end. So at this point, Kevin, the screen is all yours.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. And thanks to everyone for making this happen. The Gold family, I really appreciate this opportunity to connect with Carolina. Everyone who helped put this together, Shandol, Jim, Gabriella, and so on. Thank you for all you've done to make this work. I haven't missed the reduction in my travel time in the era of COVID, but this is actually one I really wish I could have been there in person. It's always good to go back home to Carolina. And I wish I could have been here in person with you all. We got to find a way for you to maybe, I don't know, fax me some shrimp and grits from Crook's Corner or something else. As Jim said, my talk tonight will be based on that recent book I had called Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974 that I wrote with my colleague Julian Zelizer. And it's odd, it feels odd to give a formal lecture. I'm not going to give you 45 minutes of me kind of talking to the screen. So I'll give about 15, 20 minutes in which I give a general overview of the book and its big themes, what we were trying to do with it. And then I'll give a short little story from it, which I think might be pertinent today. Now the work, again, and our title of the talk is about contemporary politics, contemporary history. And why is that important? Well, for far too long, we've treated the late 20th century and now the early 21st century as some sort of, afterthought, as a coda to the real story of 20th century U.S. history. In high schools, most courses in U.S. history don't make it past Vietnam, if they get that far. Many colleges and universities aren't that much better. But the time has really come to change that. You know, when I came to UNC as a freshman in 1990, the end of World War II had taken place 45 years before that point when I arrived on campus. Well, for a freshman arriving at UNC or Princeton today, 45 years ago is the mid-1970s. And as much as we understood 1945 and 1990 to be big capital H history, and for the era that unfolded after that period to be worthy of study, it's time for us, I think, really to think about the period from the 70s on as a period worthy of study on its own. And this book, Fault Lines, was our effort to try to make that case. The book began as a course that we co-taught for a couple of years here at Princeton called history of the United States since 1974. And the book developed out of the discoveries in and development of that course here. So why 1974? Well, the simple answer is that both Julian and I are political historians first and foremost, who recognize the significant rupture that in American politics that was the Watergate scandal. As much as we've gotten used to the realities of Watergate, as much as we talk about it now, as much as gate has become a suffix that we apply to all political scandals now, I think we have to remember just how much of a shock it was to the American people at the time when it all went down. President Nixon had just been reelected in 1972 by an overwhelming margin of the Electoral College. He won by 520 to 17. He seemed unbeatable. And yet less than 2 years later, Nixon resigned from office in disgrace. His vice president, who'd been reelected with him in 72, had also resigned in disgrace. The aftershocks of that event were incredibly significant and are still being felt today. But it wasn't just Watergate. As we noted in the book, there were a series of major events that unfolded in the years around 1974 that shocked Americans, that suggested that the post-war decades of confidence and optimism had come to an end and a new era of division and disunity had begun. So in 1973, for instance, was the first OPEC oil embargo, a move that put the spotlight on America's dependence on foreign powers for energy. It exposed the weaknesses of the nation's economy. At the same time, between 1973 and 1975 was when America drew down and then finally withdrew its forces from Vietnam in what was viewed at the time as a humiliating defeat, a sign that the world's biggest superpower was not invincible when it came to military or foreign affairs. As America's confidence in its standing in the world crumbled, thanks in large part to OPEC and Vietnam and other events, new divisions appeared at home. 1973 was the year in which Roe v. Wade was decided, a decision which increasingly became a lightning rod between liberals and conservatives and launched a new era of debates over family values and feminisms and LGBT rights. 1975, meanwhile, witnessed the brutal anti-busing riots in Boston, a stark sign that the integrationist ideals of the civil rights era were floundering and a new era of racial division was beginning. For these reasons, we saw the period of 1973, 74, 75 as launching a new era, one with a rather different dynamic than the post-war decades that had come before, one marked more by doubt and division. Now, to be sure, the decades after World War II, from the mid-40s to the mid-70s, had their own forms of division. This was, for instance, a period marked by various forms of legalized racial segregation and discrimination. It was punctuated by repressive moments in politics, like McCarthyism or the fight over the Vietnam War. But for all those very real divisions, the post-war era was largely controlled by a series of centripetal forces that pushed back against those divisions and held the country together. First and foremost, this was an era of really unrivaled economic growth, a period in which a new middle class steadily expanded year after year as union jobs with good wages lifted large numbers of Americans out of the working class and into a middle class lifestyle of comfort and stability. That sense of an expanding economy, that sense of an opportunity, and that belief in the promise of American capitalism helped paper over a lot of other divisions. Second, the post-war period was also marked, for the most part, by a faith in the federal government. Events of the 1960s would start to shake that faith. But for the most part, there was a general agreement on the part of Americans that the government not only had their best interest at heart, but was capable of actually working to affect change in their lives. And third, and I think really importantly here, the post-war period, unlike what came before or after it, was marked by what we now call the mainstream media. The big three network news programs, along with a handful of major metropolitan newspapers, really set the tone for the national conversation. They controlled the national dialogue by establishing a shared set of basic facts and a first draft interpretation of them. All of that changed from the mid-1970s on. Faith in the economy faltered in the era of stagflation, and as economic inequality became ever more pronounced, fewer and fewer Americans had faith in the system. Faith in the federal government faltered as well, with Watergate and Vietnam marking a significant break with the past and an ensuing decade that came after of incompetence and corruption only souring Americans further on Washington, D.C. The media, meanwhile, fractured into more and more parts, with cable news, talk radio, the internet, and social media creating a much more fragmented and fractious media landscape. And importantly, unlike the post-war era, when there were those centripetal forces holding the nation together, the post-Watergate era was increasingly defined by forces that promoted divisions and discord. The incentives were to push to the corners. Our politics became much more hyper-partisan due to the general sorting of liberals and conservatives into their own parties, and specific changes wrought by gerrymandering and the failure of campaign finance reforms. There were suddenly no more incentives to reach across the aisle, and in fact, you could be penalized for that. We see this now with Republicans being called rhinos, Republicans in name only, for daring to work across the aisle. We saw this during the Obama years. Our new media climate accentuated those divisions. The old broadcasting model of trying to reach out to as many Americans as possible, as we describe in the book, was replaced with a new model called narrowcasting, in which you sliced and diced the media audience, sliced and diced the American landscape, and found that audience divided into siloed, like-minded camps. Our society, meanwhile, became ever more divided. Even after the successes of the civil rights era, our cities and suburbs became more racially segregated from the 1970s on, and the integrationist ideal floundered as various groups from across the spectrum retreated into their own separate spheres. Meanwhile, with the rise of feminism and LGBT rights, meant that the old post-war concept of a nuclear family model was eclipsed by a new stage in which families could take on a wide variety of non-traditional forms. So as we looked at this era in the book, we traced four major fault lines in American life that increasingly grew and widened in these decades: political divisions and partisanship, economic inequality, increasingly strife over racial and ethnic divisions, and a new culture war over issues of sex, sexuality, and gender as well. Now, I'm happy to talk about any and all of this in the Q&A. But for my brief time now, I thought I'd dive into one moment that I think might be of interest to you today, a moment that highlights how these divisions in politics and media impact each other. And this was the resolution of the 2000 election. And it's a moment that's coming into view once again as we head into what looks like will be a hotly contested national election. Now, from our vantage point today, the 2000 presidential election seems like a major moment in the political polarization of America. But it's important to remember that right up until the very end of that election, with its contested results in Florida, the 2000 campaign, it seemed in many ways to be a race to the middle. More than anything else, both of the candidates that year sought to convince the American people that they were the best one to maintain the status quo. This was not a change election. People were looking to maintain the economic boom of the 90s. The Democratic nominee, Vice President Al Gore Jr., promised, quote, continued peace and prosperity. The Republican nominee, Texas Governor George W. Bush, advanced a similarly moderate agenda he called, quote, compassionate conservatism. Pointedly, both candidates sought to distance themselves from the partisan clashes that had marked the previous decade. As a member of the Clinton administration, Al Gore had followed the president's path of, quote, triangularization and distanced himself from the liberal members of his party. As he ran for the top spot himself, Gore likewise kept Clinton at arm's length, worried that the president's personal scandals would tarnish his own image. Bush did the same thing. He ran as an outsider. He criticized House Republicans for heartlessly, quote, balancing the budget on the backs of the poor. In a sharp break with the social conservatism that had marked his party across the 1990s, he complained that all too often, quote, my party has painted an image of America slouching towards Gomorrah, a direct reference to and a dismissal of the complaints of former Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork. Now, there were significant differences between the two men. I don't want to overstate this, especially on issues of taxes, entitlement, and the role of the federal government in general. But they did a great deal to downplay them on the campaign trail. In fact, they agreed with each other so much in the second presidential debate that it became a running joke on Saturday Night Live that they were tripping over each other to be nice and agree with one another. Now, with Gore and Bush both trying to claim the center of politics in 2000, the election became one of the closest in American history. In the end, Gore edged Bush out by about 540,000 votes in the popular vote nationwide. But as election night wore on, it became clear that neither Bush nor Gore had the number of electoral votes needed to declare victory. With every state except for Florida decided, Gore had secured 267 electoral votes to Bush's 246. Both were beneath the threshold needed to win, 270, and therefore the 25 electoral votes of Florida would determine the winner. Relying on exit polling and competing with one another to be the ones to call the race first, the networks initially awarded the state to Gore and then backed off, then awarded it to Bush and backed off again. Jon Stewart, the host of The Daily Show, spoke for many when he expressed frustration with the coverage. The great part of it, he said, was just the giant fuck up network-wise. Gore's the winner, Gore's not the winner. Bush is the winner, Bush isn't the winner. Nobody's the winner? The media declared two people president and then declared no one president. As the color-coded maps that were in place on election night remained frozen in place on those networks, first for hours and then for days and then weeks as the fight over Florida dragged on, Americans came to suddenly adopt a new shorthand for their political divisions. Red states for Republican areas, blue states for Democratic ones. And the assignment of the two colors was in fact arbitrary. The networks had started using color-coded maps in 1976 when NBC's John Chancellor informed viewers on election night that he would be coloring states for the Republican incumbent president Gerald Ford blue, and he would color states for the Democratic challenger Jimmy Carter red. NBC stuck with that original color scheme for the next election when David Brinkley pointed to a big blue map showing Reagan's landslide victory and said it looked like a California swimming pool. Over the ensuing decades, the color schemes used in network news coverage of presidential elections changed from year to year and network to network. Geraldine Ferraro noted how the big three networks displayed the results in different schemes after her ticket lost in 1984. One network map of the United States was entirely blue for Republicans, she recalled. On another network, the color motif was a blanket of red. Magazines had their own color schemes too. Time magazine, for instance, used blue for Republicans and red for Democrats from 1988 up until 2000. But in 2000, the networks aligned in a new scheme for their coverage. They all went red for Republicans and blue for Democrats. And as Americans stared endlessly at those electoral maps, the color scheme became permanently cemented in their minds. Importantly, the more they talked about those maps, the more there seemed to be an apparent civil war between two distinct physical territories, the red states against the blue states. Over the course of the presidency of George W. Bush, those two terms became fixed in the public mind as a new shorthand for partisan camps. Now, conservatives embraced that 2000 electoral map, and they embraced that map rather than the number because the number showed a 271 to 267 lead, a very narrow victory. The map looked like a much bigger blowout for Bush. That map with its central core of red states was a sign for them that the nation wasn't evenly split between the parties, but was instead a bright red Bush country. Some Republicans took this further, putting forth a map that didn't just show individual states, but individual counties. Looking at things on a county-by-county basis, of course, makes the country seem even more red, even more Republican. While Democratic strength is often concentrated in densely populated cities and suburbs, Republican votes are more spread out in rural areas and thus cover a larger area of counties. In areas of the country where the counties are huge in size, in the Mountain West and the Midwest, for instance, this is even more pronounced. That map proved so popular among conservatives, it was marketed for use on t-shirts and mugs and mouse pads and so on. The sheer dominance of the red over blue was taken as a sign of the overwhelming dominance of George W. Bush too. Now, of course, such a map is misleading because it stresses the size of land rather than the actual number of voters, which is what matters. On such a map, the giant red mass that covers Wyoming and Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, that contains about as many voters as the almost invisible blue dot of the borough of Brooklyn in New York. However misleading such maps were, they became commonplace in our political culture. It's kind of remarkable how quickly they took root. So much so that even Democrats were forced to respond. In his breakout speech to the 2004 Democratic National Convention, then State Senator Barack Obama tried to take this concept head on. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, he said, but I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. The speech proved to be a sensation, especially among younger voters who'd grown up in this era of stark partisanship and polarization, who yearned for something new. The speech launched Obama to the Senate that year, and then 4 years later into the presidency. Now, though Obama had hoped to remind Americans that they were, quote, the United States of America, his 2 terms in office saw the partisan polarization become even more pronounced. Despite his best efforts, to promote bipartisanship, congressional Republicans, following the lead of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, came to believe that their own political fortune depended on withholding their votes from any Obama legislation and by default, making it seem to be partisan and a failure. As Senator George Voinovich of Ohio later recalled, their marching orders were simple. Whatever Obama proposed, they had to oppose. If he was for it, we had to be against it. After 8 years of deepening divisions during the Obama era, President Trump has now self-consciously embraced the polarizing image of red states versus blue states. Much like Bush, Trump won the presidency despite losing the popular vote. And as a result, he leaned heavily on the Electoral College and that map as a sign of his legitimacy. Even though his margin in the Electoral College was small, it's the 48th biggest victory out of 56 presidential elections. It's in the bottom fifth all time. Trump has repeatedly called up this electoral map as proof of his popularity. He loves this map so much, he's repeatedly brought them up at official events, even bragging about them in joint press conferences with the Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of Israel. Just before his first 100 days was up, he interrupted an update about relations with China to distribute printed copies of the map to reporters in the room. Repeatedly, when addressing supporters, he often invokes the map as a sign that he and they represent a majority of the nation. Those maps serve as a reminder of the political polarization and the stark partisanship that rules Washington these days. But it's important, I think, for us to remember that they have a history like everything else. The imagined civil war between red states and blue states is in many ways overblown. And if we return to their origins, a presidential race in which two candidates initially ran to claim the same common ground in the middle, I think we can remember that the lines that we see dividing us today are in many ways drawn with our own hand. Thank you. I assume someone will come in and ask questions now.
Thank you, Kevin. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
So our first question here from Kathy. You've used the noun faith quite a bit, faith in government, faith in media, and so on. May I ask you to speak to the increasing number of those without a specific religious faith, that is, no religious affiliation, which might contribute to the present fault lines as compared to the post-war period?
That's a great question. I meant faith in a kind of non-religious belief term, but that's a great question. And I think what's really remarkable, and this maybe speaks not to this book, but the one I did before this book called One Nation Under God, where I addressed religious nationalism and its role in America in the mid-20th century, is that we see there's a certain politicization of faith that takes place over the mid-20th century. So go back into that period. That and certainly would be one of the things that Americans believed held them together. And it's promoted by Dwight Eisenhower, who we often don't think of as a religious president. He thought of himself that way. It's promoted in the mid-50s, this new idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition. That's a neologism from the period. This concept of America's tradition of faith founded in the three religions of democracy, Judaism, Catholicism, and Protestantism generally. That comes about in this mid-20th century period as something that's supposed to hold the country together. By the end of that period, as I talk about in that other book, President Nixon has weaponized faith and made it something polarizing, has marshaled that faith, not as something to bring Americans together, as Eisenhower always tried, but rather as a partisan wedge. And that becomes the new trend across the decades that we talk about from the mid-70s and on. And so the rise of what we call nuns now, not Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, is really a remarkable thing. We've got there are different ways to track this: the spiritual but not religious, the not observant, atheists, agnostics. There's a lot of different categories in there. But it's essentially about 1 in 5 Americans now claim to be that, right? Which is a remarkable shift. Again, back in Eisenhower's era, Eisenhower could pronounce, and found many Americans agreeing with him, as he said, that the concept of an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. You can't be an American without faith. He said this in a famous quote, our system of government makes no sense unless it's founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. So Eisenhower didn't care about the substance of religion. What he cared about most importantly there was the idea that you had a religion, any religion, didn't really matter, just something, right? And that general faith that some kind of religion had to be behind America is something that really held true for a long time, and for many Americans still does today. But the fact that we've got about 1/5 Americans who don't have that kind of theological commitment, like the person asked this question, is I think really important. And what we've seen recently is a recognition on the part of political leaders that those voters are actually fully American. We saw this with Barack Obama when he would give remarkable speeches where he talked about believers and non-believers. The fact that a president was making room for people who expressly did not have religious faith is really remarkable. Now, of course, all of that change is happening on the Democratic side, right? So the Democratic coalition is one that includes people of deep faith and people of no faith. It's much more religiously homogenous on the Republican side. So I don't think we haven't quite reached the moment in which you're going to see a breakaway from those old reliances on faith. The rituals I talk about in One Nation Under God, the National Prayer Breakfast, which has started in this period, or Reagan's habit of ending a speech with "God bless America." You'll still see those, I think, for some time. But we're reaching more and more towards a tipping point in which I think those traditions will be revisited, if not quietly abandoned.
Yeah, there's a real generational dynamic to that, too. A question I'd like to come back to if we have time, but we have a great run of questions now here on the screen. A number of them are related to polarization in our moment. I have a question, how would you trace the current political polarization to the resentment over the uneven effects of the 2008 financial crisis or some other crystallizing event? And I think a really interesting one here, how would you coach a candidate today? In terms of sort of trying to create some measure of unity around shared values and aspirations?
Well, let me start with the coaching part, because this is free advice, and if you're listening, you're free to take it or leave it. I think a general winning strategy for candidates is kind of to do what Biden did last night, which is to really talk to them about issues that matter in their own lives. I think too often politicians get swept up in the world of Washington, D.C., both in terms of their own egos and the weird shorthand, where they talk about laws and rules and regulations that no one around a kitchen table cares about. So I think talk about the things people have in common, not just their values, but pocketbook issues about healthcare and school and their communities. That's a way in which I think it's an obvious statement, but I think that's a way in which voters can really feel a connection with a politician, with a political candidate. Is there any one moment that led to this partisanship? The 2008 financial meltdown is part of it, certainly in the fact of those on the left who felt nothing was done at the time. But it's more, I think, as I hinted at in the talk, it's the strategy that congressional Republicans take to stop Obama. We have to remember Obama comes in 2008 with what at the time was an incredible mandate, a huge margin, 360 electoral votes, a pretty big margin, a pretty big commanding mandate from the public, the House and the Senate, both in Democratic hands. And what he got on the part of Republicans was fierce opposition. And again, Obama had come in promising, as he said, to create a kind of a post-partisan future. That's what he said. And I think he was really naive when he said that, but I think seemed to believe that. And so if you look at his early moves, staffing his cabinet, he put 2 Republicans in, nearly had a third. Judd Gregg almost came in as a Commerce Secretary, and then bailed when Republicans complained. Had he had 3 Republicans in there, that would have been the most bipartisan cabinet since Franklin Roosevelt's wartime cabinet in World War II. His approach to early legislation was always to seek compromise. The stimulus package was 1/3 Republican authored tax cuts that had been stymied in previous congressional sessions. He brought them back. 1/3 of his plan were Republican ideas from the start. His healthcare program borrowed from Romney's ideas, and Lowell Weiker's plan in 1993, 1994. So Obama had constantly tried to reach out and offer these olive branches to congressional Republicans. But both Mitch McConnell in the Senate and Eric Cantor in the House say quite explicitly, we have their statements on this, that their plan was not to roll over, not to work with Obama, but rather to deny him any bipartisan success by simply withholding their votes, right? The bipartisanship has to be by nature a two-way street. And if the Republicans held back their votes, they could paint Obama as a partisan. And that's exactly what they did. And so even with those commanding margins in both the House and the Senate, he had to fight tooth and nail to get the Affordable Care Act passed, to get the stimulus package through. And that really set up a stage for trench warfare that lasted throughout his presidency. And we saw as Thomas Mann and like on Norm's last name, did in their book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, was a Norman Ornstein, sorry, a great study of this period from a bipartisan set of observers. They show pretty clearly the way in which across the board that trench warfare initiated by the Republicans in Congress really kind of blew up a lot of the lasting norms that had still been in place. If you look back at how Democrats had treated, say, the No Child Left Behind Act, a big initiative that President George W. Bush had come in with. It's got, Ted Kennedy as a co-sponsor along with John Boehner in the House. I mean, it really was a bipartisan effort. That kind of thing was gone. And instead you had this kind of deep fighting at every level, which really, I think, set up the stage for the hyper-partisanship that really led us into this moment of the Trump era.
I think all of that relates to a series of questions here about, what all this might or might not mean for the future of the two-party system in the U.S. Is there a chance of breaking free of that? Or the other question that comes to mind, a lot of our colleagues, of course, are fond of arguing that perhaps 2020 is going to be for the Republican Party what 1852 was for the Whigs.
Right.
If you look in your crystal ball, you all started my historical training, and it's a training that's largely based on hindsight. So it's tough to make predictions. But I will say, looking back to elections we've seen in the past, that this question about what happens to the current system is, of course, going to depend on what happens in this election. As long as Republicans, not just Trump, but Republicans at the House, Senate, gubernatorial level, even local level, find that running on the kind of the Trump style wins, they'll keep doing it. That's what politicians do. If they are, however, handed a smashing defeat at the polls, again, not just Trump, but down the line, I think you'll see a clear recoiling from that. We've seen large numbers of conservatives, people who'd worked on Republican campaigns in the past, Republican national chairmen, have broken with Trump and said they're going to vote for Biden. That doesn't mean they're liberal Democrats by any means. It means they are taking issue with what's going on in this party. But there's a large enough group there that if the current Republicans, if the diehards go down with Trump, as it looks like some of them might, if enough of that happens, you might either see those kind of never Trump Republicans reclaim the party, or you could see them branch off and form their own new party. And so, yeah, they could go the way of the Whigs. Again, way too soon to say. But if we get a kind of resounding decision here, and the Republicans are blown out across the board, I think you will see a new direction. A number of people have picked up, on your remarks related to the kind of the decline of a kind of consolidated mainstream media, or the fracturing of that, and interested to hear you talk a little bit more about the prospects for politics and what one might describe as a post-fax environment, and related to that, some questions about historical parallels to the ways that conspiracy theories, currently figure in American politics.
Well, let me start with the media one, and then I'll probably forget to remind me about the conspiracy theory callback. The media fragmentation is one that it's a major theme in the book. In fact, we note in the intro that when we talk about fault lines in the title, we're talking about not just those lines of division, but also the important role the media tells Americans about who's at fault for all this. And what happens across this period is a really steady fragmenting. And there's an initial optimism early on in the 70s that as the media opens up, you're going to get more voices and better informed electorate, and people are going to be communicating with people all across the country in wildly exciting ways. And this happens with first the advent of cable television. CNN goes on the air in June of 1980 and sparks some imitators. Talk radio takes off. The internet, first blogs and then social media. And you increasingly find this landscape becoming much more fragmented and as a result, much more fractious. The question I often get here is, what's the role of the end of the fairness doctrine? If you don't know, the fairness doctrine was an old policy that the FCC had really from the late 40s until 1987 when it's killed by the Reagan administration. And the policy had essentially said that broadcasters were doing a public service. They were broadcasting over the public airwaves, whether it be TV or radio. And as a result, they had a certain duty to the public to present both sides of contentious political issues. The goal was to foster debate, but it actually just made most broadcasters play things down the middle. Conservatives always complained that it wasn't quite down the middle. It was actually kind of a left-leaning liberal establishment view that was being shown in these programs. And so they hated the fairness doctrine and they fought against it. And Reagan's FCC finally dropped the policy in 1987. And so a lot of people ask me, whenever I give this talk, can we have a fairness doctrine again and get back to that? You could have a fairness doctrine. The problem is that much of the media today is outside the fairness doctrine's purview. These aren't public airwaves. In fact, at the time when the fairness doctrine was killed, the existence of cable television was used as an argument for why they no longer needed the fairness doctrine. There weren't just 3 networks anymore. You had hundreds of them at the time. So you could do away with it. And indeed, cable news exists outside this. The real change came with talk radio. Talk radio had been bound by the fairness doctrine, and when it gets unleashed is when you see the rise of a new hyper-partisan model in the likes of Rush Limbaugh. And Limbaugh, in turn, inspires the creation of Fox News. Roger Ailes had been the producer of Limbaugh's television program from 92 to 96, and then in 96 immediately goes to work for Fox News, and they use Limbaugh as a model. So the genie's out of the bottle. I don't think there's going to be any kind of regulation along the lines of the fairness doctrine that will fix things. What they could do, and what people have talked about, is going after some of these people who pretend like they're not media outlets. Facebook, Twitter, all these sites on the internet, social media, that don't take responsibility for their content. If they had to take responsibility for that, the way in which ABC News would run into trouble if they broadcast something, or even Fox News, if they ran into trouble broadcasting something, they'd be open to lawsuits. If Facebook was liable for that, I think they would police themselves a lot better and a lot more quickly. So that's an option, I think, out there. But again, it may just come down to what killed the fairness doctrine was ordinary people demanded it and political leaders listened. If ordinary people use their role as a consumer of media to select things that are more fact-based, that are stronger, that have a better model, that'll ultimately change it. That's a long and slow process, though. I don't think there's a silver bullet for this.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, sorry.
Yeah.
Are there counterparts for conspiracy theories?
Yeah, if you see, I think, historical parallels to this moment.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, look, as a political historian, my favorite thing to get when I go into the archives is to reach for the folder called Crank File or Nut Letters. They all have a different name for them, but it's usually the most fun stuff. So it was certainly out there. The thing was that back in the day, the conspiracy theories were confined to the fringes, right? The John Birch Society had some insane ideas in the late 50s and early 60s about Dwight Eisenhower being a communist sleeper agent, and fluoridation of our water was a plot by communists to control our children. But those remained largely contained to the fringes. In fact, conservatives made a lot of profit by denouncing the fringes, by saying, oh, we're not like them. What we have today is those fringes are moving more and more into the mainstream. So we've got things like the QAnon folks today who are increasingly getting retweeted by the president, are being supported with a wink and a nod by Republican officials and candidates in the way in which the Birch Society never was. So we certainly have had these conspiracy theories before, but it's been a perennial in American political and social life, but they've been mainlined now. They've been brought into the mainstream in ways that are astounding.
How does, so we've talked about Congress, we've talked about the presidency. How do the courts figure? in this story?
The courts loom incredibly large here, and because they increasingly become a place that is not perceived as the impartial arbiter of all these divisions, but are rather the goal for political divisions is to win the court, right? And conservatives like to point to the Robert Bork hearings. We saw this recently with the Barrett nomination. There's a response that, well, liberals started this, Democrats started this with Bork. The Bork hearing, we have to remember, was one in which he got a full hearing in the Senate. He was voted down in the Judiciary Committee. He was voted and then sought and got on the floor of Congress, even though he was voted down by the Judiciary Committee. They gave him a full vote. Many Republicans voted against him again. So he got a full hearing. But Bork wasn't the first fight. We have to go back into the Nixon era, and you see when Earl Warren stepped down, LBJ tried to appoint his successor, Abe Fortas, who would have ensured the liberal policies of the Warren Court continued for another generation. Republicans filibustered that nomination and actually got Fortas to resign. They won 2 new seats on the court that Nixon was allowed to fill. Nixon then had 2 of his own candidates shot down, Carswell and I'm blanking on the other one. They're pretty forgettable. And then we had the fights over them. And so there was a period of contentious fights in the late 60s, early 70s, in which the court quickly becomes an object of politics. And from that point on, that bell is rung, it doesn't change. And so you don't see the old habit in which nominees to the court could be, routinely approved in a matter of weeks, if not days. It becomes this long, drawn-out fight. And it's only gotten worse and worse as time has gone on. And it's gotten that way, I'd argue, because both sides, liberals and conservatives, have increasingly seen the court as the place to do their battles, right? So abortion with Roe v. Wade kicks us off in 1973. It's hard to argue this is a Democratic issue. The decision is written by one of Nixon's appointees, but it increasingly becomes a way in which abortion is sidelined off to the courts. But conservatives do this too. We saw this with conservatives in Congress would regularly vote to uphold the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court eviscerates that with Shelby County. The conservatives had tried to do things on gun rights that never got through Congress. The Supreme Court establishes an individual right to bear arms in 2008. So increasingly these things that Congress can't handle get pushed off to the court. So the court becomes the end-all and be-all. People see it in a very tribal way, and they want to get their people on the court, and it becomes so vitally important. In fact, I don't think you can explain the rise of Donald Trump without that meeting he has in July of 2016, where he brings evangelical and fundamentalist leaders into Trump Tower and gives them a list of Supreme Court justices he's going to nominate when he gets vacancies. Those justices, those potential nominees, are what win him their support and ultimately wins him the election.
There are a number of people in the Q&A chat, I think wondering, maybe worrying about whether we're headed towards something even darker. I mean, I think there is an inclination, and maybe this is a sort of generational confession, to, wring our hands and, and bemoan what's become American politics, but somewhere back in the back of our heads is this little voice that says, well, it will all turn out all right in the end. What do you think of the prospects for something darker? Are we on the path to authoritarianism?
Well, look, as an historian, I'm naturally inclined to pessimism because I know how bad things have gotten in the past and how easily they can go bad again. So I don't think people there are overreacting, certainly not in this moment. There's always the chance. This idea that, as Sinclair Lewis said, it can't happen here is nonsense. It can easily happen here. There's nothing about America that prevents it. In fact, there are several structural issues, as we've seen over the last few years, which could make this likely, or not likely, or at least possible. So I do think people should be worried about that. That said, we could have an election if the polling holds up, if there aren't the snafus people expect, if people turn out in record numbers as it looks. in which there's actually a landslide for Biden, and this is all wrapped up in a, if not election night, in a few days. That could easily happen, and we could look back on this and think, there we go. I'm, of course, thinking about, I gave a talk at Cornell about this time in 2016, where it seemed a sure bet that Trump was going down, and the idea of him being elected was ludicrous. So I'm thinking of that in this moment, that I don't want to be too overly optimistic. My general policy is to err on the side of pessimism and then be pleasantly surprised when the worst doesn't happen.
Spend too much time these days reading our colleague Tim Snyder.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a pretty dark.
I think I'm professionally depressing. Tim has an entire other gear.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was going to say there at the beginning that right at the end, I thought you tried to give us a little bit of hope. And we've talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could make another pass at it more directly. I mean, just where do you see the possibilities of some sort of reconciliation? A couple of people have asked about the emergence of a new centrism, and again, I think maybe there's something interesting happening generationally. I mean, I'm struck. By
I think absolutely. I mean, look,
protest and.
Yeah, no, and I'll tell you,
and how diverse they are, and young.
Yeah. Look, the silver lining of the Trump era, for me, and I mean this sincerely, I'm not trying to sugarcoat this, is that so many Americans have woken up, and it used to be, for most of my adult lifetime, that Americans thought of politics as this distant, removed thing, and that they were doing their duty if they voted every 4 years. Maybe they were great, they voted every 2 years in the midterms. Maybe they voted in local elections too. And I think Americans have realized, and they realized it pretty quickly after the 2016 results, that democracy isn't a spectator sport. You can't stay on the sidelines. You've got to get into it. You've got to run for office. You've got to get involved with causes you care about. And so the massive outpouring of public protests in the last 4 years has really been remarkable. The Women's March, March for Our Lives Against Gun Violence, Black Lives Matter, we've certainly seen a reawakening of kind of small d democratic action, which I think is incredibly important. And as you know, Jim, it really is on generational lines. There's been a real awakening of younger voters, not yet voting in the numbers I think they could or need to really shape the national conversation, but certainly their impact has been felt. And I think we're starting to see this impact in terms of a new generation really pressuring the Democratic Party to move much more to the left. And I think it's both in terms of the frustrations they've felt in their own lives, having come of age in the wake of the 2008 financial meltdown, and now going through all this, they really are willing to throw off old orthodoxies. But also, they didn't come of age when I came of age, during the era of Reagan, when Democrats were kind of largely in a defensive crouch, not wanting to be overrun by the Reagan Revolution, which was largely overblown at the time, but really reacting to that and trying to adjust themselves, as Bill Clinton did, to the Reagan Revolution and make adjustments, make cuts down. You're starting to see a move in the other direction. And I'd say to those who are younger and those who are on the left, again, if you look at Biden's career in the Senate, he's always been dead center in the Democratic caucus. If you plot this, and they do this in congressional votes, Biden is always in the middle of the Democratic bell curve. He's right in the middle no matter where they are. They move right, he's with them. They move left, he's with them. So he's certainly pliable and can be pressured to the left. And he will be if enough young people and liberals get out, and leftists get out and vote, and then demand on his administration, should he come into office, to pull left. And so there certainly is, even in this dark moment, there's hope for change. And so if you look at, in the aftermath of Watergate, was when a lot of the open government stuff happened. This is, we got the expansions of campaign finance and FOIA and electoral reforms. And there certainly was a flowering of journalism that really exposed a large set of problems that have been rooted into American life. Look back to the crash in 1929. That was one of the darkest chapters in American history, but it gave us the New Deal. Right? There's a moment here in which things get bad enough that it wakes people up, that it raises awareness about fundamental problems in our politics, in our economy, in our society, and calls for real change. So I do think we're at a moment now where you could see really important structural changes to the American electoral system, to voting rights. You could see real important changes on policing, on the kind of law and order politics that have governed this country for several decades now. So there is, I think, a moment here. We've seen the kind of the seedlings of a new politics sprout up in the last 4 years, and I think if they find people in power in Congress and the White House who are more willing to listen to those voices, I think they can find real purchase.
Yeah, it's a dark moment, but it's a great time to be a historian, isn't it?
Yeah. I could use it being a little less needed lately. That'd be fine. I would love if my work on white supremacists and religious nationalists was a little less relevant today. But yeah, it is good to be a little needed.
Yeah. Well, here's one last question, and that is, where do you gather your news, and how do you sift through the noise to find legitimate sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. I fall victim to the same stuff everybody does of kind of easing into an echo chamber, but I constantly try to pull myself out of a circle of people who agree with me and listen to other voices. So I read thoughtful conservatives, foreign policy, Daniel Larison of the American Conservative. The folks who are behind the Lincoln Project and the Bulwark are good on this. I'll read National Review. I used to read the Weekly Standard before it folded. To try to find, I think, thoughtful conservative voices who may have a viewpoint I disagree with. The same with the left. There are people far to the left of me, and I try to read them. To read more liberal folks, say The Nation or Jacobin or places like that, that are going to challenge my thinking. Because if you only have a kind of circle where you are in an echo chamber and you're just getting the people who agree with you, your thoughts become dull, your arguments become weak. Even if your only goal is to win political arguments with people on the left or the right, you're going to be better at that if you're doing sparring practice with people on the left or the right regularly. You're being exposed to their ideas. So I try wherever possible to get out of that box. I'm on Twitter, and I intentionally follow people with whom I disagree on the left and the right, to kind of challenge my assumptions and to have an open conversation across ideological lines whenever possible.
To say you're on Twitter is an understatement. I think you're probably one of the most followed historians out there. What's the magic?
What's the magic? I got dragged kicking and screaming on a Twitter by my publisher. The Basic Books with One Nation Under God basically told me I had to be on Twitter because that's what you have to do to promote. And for the first year, it was just kind of on this day in history, which is fine, but a million places can do that. I guess I resonate because I speak my mind and I speak how I speak. I don't hold back in terms of what I'm really thinking. If you follow me, you know that. But also, I like to use Twitter as a teaching tool. I think far too many people use Twitter as a way to send out their press releases. I certainly do that if I've done something. I promoted this on Twitter. I do that. But I also like to use Twitter first and foremost as a way to teach. And so I do what I do in class. I give people primary documents, I give people the evidence, and I say, here, read this yourself. So much of Twitter becomes a kind of he said, she said, who knows, throw up your hands problem, that I find giving people the actual materials and saying, look at this yourself, use your brain, think about this, is a pretty effective way. And I found people are interested in that. So, and I'm certainly not alone. As you know, there are tons of other people, tons of other historians on Twitter who do the same stuff with me. It's just, it's an easy way for me to do it. And honestly, it just keeps me from yelling at the TV. So my wife is incredibly happy about that.
I love the way you've organized some of your threads, in effect, into a syllabus.
Yeah, I kind of realized I created a course. It's heavy on some moments, but it kind of all came together at the end.
Well, Kevin, this has been great fun. We could go on for another hour, I think. But thanks so much for doing this tonight. I think everybody who has been part of this really appreciates your thoughtful remarks and the chance to have a real conversation with you. And we will get you back to Chapel Hill in person.
I'm going to hold you to that. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks again for having me, Jim, and for hosting this. It really is a pleasure. I only wish you could be in person, but we'll do that soon.
We will. And thanks to Jim and Jonathan Gold for their
Thank you very
generosity
much.
in
Yes.
establishing this lecture. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Follow Kevin Kruse on Twitter. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.